You think you know what a doctor looks like? White coat, stethoscope, that reassuring smile that says everything will be fine. But tonight, while you sleep safely in your sterile world of modern medicine, I'm going to show you what doctors really looked like when death walked the earth like a starving wolf. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a medical mask the same way again. Picture this. It's 1348, and Europe is drowning in its own blood. The Black Death has arrived like an uninvited guest who decides to burn down the house instead of leaving. Cities that once echoed with merchant songs now whisper only with the rattling breath of the dying. And, in this apocalyptic theater, enter the plague doctors, those leather-clad harbingers of false hope who would make your worst nightmares seem like children's fairy tales. But here's what they never told you in school, what the sanitized history books conveniently forgot to mention. These weren't heroes. They were opportunists, grave robbers in medical disguise, predators who fed on humanity's darkest hour. They didn't come to heal, they came to harvest. The dying were their crop, and business was booming. You see that iconic beak-shaped mask everyone finds so fascinating at costume parties? That leather monstrosity wasn't just protection, it was a feeding apparatus. Inside that grotesque proboscis, they stuffed herbs, spices, and aromatic substances, not to filter disease, but to mask the stench of their own moral decay. They believed diseases traveled through bad air, what they called miasma. But the real poison was walking among the patients, wearing a mask that made them look like death's own accountant. These doctors charged fees that would make your insurance company blush. Entire families would sell their possessions, their homes, their dignity, just to have one of these leather-wrapped vultures examine their plague-riddled loved ones. And what did they get for their life savings? A theatrical performance that would make carnival acts seem sophisticated. The plague doctor would arrive at your door like a messenger from hell itself. That long, black leather coat crackling with each step, that wide-brimmed hat casting shadows that seemed to devour light. The wooden cane they carried wasn't just for walking, it was for poking, prodding, and keeping their distance from the human wreckage they pretended to treat. They wouldn't even touch you with their own hands. Your suffering was handled through intermediaries, wooden instruments that kept the almighty doctor's flesh safely separated from your contaminated misery. But let me tell you about their methods, their medical wisdom, that cost desperate families everything they owned. They would prescribe bleeding because apparently when you're already hemorrhaging internally from plague, what you really need is to lose more blood. They recommended baths in rosewater and crushed pearls, treatments that were about as effective as praying to furniture. They suggested patients eat crushed emeralds because nothing says medical expertise like recommending people consume gemstones while they're dying from bacterial infection. Some of these practitioners were legitimate physicians, university-trained men who had studied the ancient texts and earned their credentials through years of education. But when the plague hit, when regular medicine proved as useless as a paper umbrella in a hurricane, many of them transformed into something else entirely. They became performance artists of false hope, selling elaborate theater to people who had nothing left to lose. The legitimate ones were almost worse than the charlatans. At least the frauds knew they were lying. The educated doctors genuinely believed their methods worked, which made them more dangerous than any snake oil salesman. They had the confidence of knowledge backing their incompetence, the certainty of education supporting their failures. They would bleed you to death with the same scholarly precision they once used to recite Latin poetry. And then there were the opportunists, the ones who saw the plague as a career opportunity. Men with no medical training whatsoever would acquire the costume, the mask, the attitude, and suddenly they were plague doctors. The dying couldn't exactly check credentials, and the desperate don't ask for medical licenses. All you needed was the costume and the confidence to charge premium prices for premium disappointment. These fake doctors were particularly creative with their treatments. They would prescribe amulets made from the hearts of freshly killed birds, powders ground from the bones of saints, and potions brewed from the urine of virgin unicorns. The more exotic and expensive the treatment, the more effective it seemed to desperate families. Human psychology hasn't changed much. We still believe that if something costs more, it must work better. The real horror wasn't just their medical incompetence, it was their complete detachment from human suffering. They developed a professional callousness that would make executioners seem emotional. They would examine plague victims like livestock, making notes about symptoms while the patient writhed in agony. They treated human beings like specimens, collecting data while families watched their loved ones transform into something unrecognizable. Some plague doctors became obsessed with documentation, creating detailed records of symptoms, progression, and death. They would sketch the buboes, those swollen lymph nodes that gave the Black Death its distinctive signature. They measured the fever, timed the delirium, calculated the hours between initial symptoms and final breath. They were scientific in their approach to human catastrophe, methodical in their observation of mass extinction. This obsession with documentation revealed something deeply disturbing about human nature. When faced with unprecedented suffering, some people respond with compassion, others with fear. But these doctors responded with curiosity. They saw the plague as a learning opportunity, a chance to advance medical knowledge through the systematic study of death. They were willing to profit from apocalypse. to build careers on the foundation of collapsed civilizations. The plague doctors also served another function that history prefers to whisper about. They were the ones who decided who lived and who died, not through medical intervention, but through triage based on ability to pay. Rich merchants got the full theatrical treatment, complete with exotic remedies and prolonged bedside manner. Poor peasants got a quick poke with a wooden cane and a shrug. The plague might have been democratic in its killing, but medical attention was reserved for those who could afford the performance. But here's what really happened behind those leather masks, the secret that the historical records try to hide. Many plague doctors stopped pretending to treat patients altogether. Instead, they became death's bookkeepers, documenting the dying for bureaucratic purposes. They would certify deaths, inventory the belongings of the deceased, and facilitate the transfer of property. They were grief administrators, managing the paperwork of apocalypse. The most successful plague doctors were those who understood that their real product wasn't medicine, it was hope. They sold the illusion that something could be done, that human knowledge could triumph over divine punishment. They were merchants of false comfort, peddling the fantasy that expertise could conquer the unconquerable. And people bought it, literally, until they had nothing left to sell except their own lives. This transformation of healers into profiteers reveals something fundamental about human nature under extreme stress. When civilization crumbles, when the normal rules no longer apply, people don't automatically become noble or heroic. They become whatever survival requires. The plague doctors became predators because predation paid better than healing. They adapted to apocalypse by abandoning their humanity, and they prospered while the world burned around them. But this story, this chronicle of medical horror, didn't end with the plague. The lessons learned by those leather-wrapped vultures, the knowledge they gained about human desperation and profitable suffering, didn't die with them. Next time you see a medical bill that bankrupts families, remember the plague doctor. Next time you watch pharmaceutical companies price life-saving medications beyond the reach of those who need them, think about those black-clad figures who first discovered that human suffering could be monetized, and realize how little has changed since death stalked the earth wearing a leather mask and carrying a wooden cane. You think you've seen the worst of what those beak-faced demons could do? You think charging desperate families their life savings was the limit of their moral bankruptcy? Oh, you sweet, naive soul. What I just showed you was merely the appetizer. The real feast of human depravity is about to begin, and trust me, you're going to need something stronger than herbal remedies to stomach what comes next. Because those plague doctors didn't just steal money from the dying. They stole something far more precious, something that, once taken, can never be returned. They stole the last moments of human dignity, the final threads of hope that connect us to our humanity. And they did it with such methodical precision, such calculated cruelty, that even the plague itself would have been impressed by their efficiency. Let me take you deeper into their world, into the chambers where they practiced their dark arts. Picture yourself lying on a straw mattress, your body consumed by fever, your skin erupting in those telltale buboes that mark you as plague's chosen victim. The leather-clad figure approaches, and you can hear the rustling of that cursed coat, the tap-tap-tap of that wooden cane against the stone floor. But what happens next will make you understand why some people preferred to die alone rather than summon these merchants of false salvation. The plague doctor's examination wasn't medical, it was theatrical. They would circle your bed like a vulture sizing up carrion, that grotesque beak tilting left and right as they studied your suffering. They wouldn't touch you, wouldn't comfort you, wouldn't even speak directly to you. Instead, they would address your family, discussing your condition as if you were already a corpse, as if your consciousness was merely an inconvenient detail in their professional assessment. Their diagnostic methods were pure performance art designed to justify their astronomical fees. They would hold up glass vials filled with colored liquids, claiming they could determine the exact progression of your disease by examining the color of your urine. They would consult elaborate charts covered in astrological symbols, pretending that the position of Saturn somehow influenced the swelling of your lymph nodes. They carried leather-bound books filled with incomprehensible Latin text, muttering incantations that sounded medical, but were actually recipes for soup or shopping lists written in scholarly language. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The plague doctors developed a systematic approach to extracting maximum payment from dying patients. They would arrive with an apprentice, usually a young man desperate enough to risk plague exposure for a few coins. This apprentice would inventory everything of value in the household while the doctor performed his theatrical examination. They weren't just treating patients, they were appraising estates, calculating exactly how much they could extract before the family had nothing left to give. The treatment regimens they prescribed were designed to be expensive, complicated, and completely ineffective. They would recommend a series of procedures that required multiple visits, each one more costly than the last. First, they would prescribe bloodletting using their own specially designed tools that patients were required to purchase. Then came the purging, requiring exotic herbs that could only be obtained through the doctor's personal connections. Finally, they would recommend protective amulets blessed by priests they claimed to know personally, sold at prices that would make modern pharmaceutical companies weep with envy. The bloodletting ritual was particularly horrific. The plague doctor would use a device called a phleem, a sharp instrument designed to open veins with surgical precision. But instead of relieving suffering, this procedure weakened patients who were already fighting for their lives. The doctors would collect the blood in special bowls, claiming they could diagnose the patient's condition by examining the color and consistency of what they had drained. In reality, they were literally bleeding people to death while charging them for the privilege. Some plague doctors became obsessed with the concept of balancing humors, the ancient belief that illness resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids. They would create elaborate treatment plans designed to restore this balance, requiring patients to consume specific foods, avoid certain activities, and follow rigid schedules that governed every aspect of their remaining life. These regimens were so complex that families would hire servants specifically to manage the dying person's compliance with the doctor's orders. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical abuse. Plague doctors would deliver prognoses with the emotional warmth of tax collectors, informing families that their loved one had hours or days to live. Then, immediately transitioning to discussions about payment schedules, they would negotiate prices while the patient listened, turning the deathbed into a marketplace where human life was just another commodity to be bought and sold. Many plague doctors carried what they called diagnostic instruments, elaborate contraptions that served no medical purpose but looked impressively scientific. They had astrolabes for determining the astronomical influence on disease, crystal balls for divining the patient's spiritual condition, and metallic devices that supposedly measured the intensity of fever through some mystical process. These instruments were props in an elaborate con game designed to convince desperate families that they were receiving cutting-edge medical care. The most successful plague doctors were those who understood that their real skill wasn't medicine, it was psychology. They knew exactly how to manipulate grief, how to exploit desperation, how to transform hope into currency. They would arrive at the bedside with an air of confident authority, speaking in medical terminology that sounded impressive but meant nothing. They would nod sagely at symptoms, as if they had seen this exact condition countless times before and knew exactly how to treat it. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of plague doctor culture was their complete detachment from the human cost of their deception. They would attend dinner parties where they bragged about their latest cases, discussing patient suffering with the casual indifference of merchants comparing inventory. They developed a professional vocabulary that dehumanized their victims, referring to patients as cases or subjects rather than people. They spoke of death rates and symptom progression as if they were discussing crop yields or weather patterns. Some plague doctors kept detailed journals of their treatments, not for medical advancement, but for personal amusement. They would record the exact words spoken by dying patients, the expressions on family members' faces, the sounds people made as they struggled for their final breaths. These journals weren't scientific documents, they were collections of human misery preserved for the entertainment of their authors. The plague doctors also developed elaborate rituals around death certification. They would arrive after a patient had died, conduct a theatrical examination of the corpse, then issue official documents declaring the cause of death. These certificates were required for burial, property transfer, and insurance claims, giving the plague doctors enormous power over grieving families. They could delay burial by claiming uncertainty about the cause of death, forcing families to pay additional fees for expedited certification. The most cynical plague doctors would actually bet on patient outcomes, wagering money on who would die first, who would linger longest, who would recover against all odds. They turned human suffering into a gambling game, treating death like a sporting event where they held inside information about the likely winners and losers. They would share this information with wealthy patrons, creating investment opportunities based on predicted mortality rates. Some plague doctors became so skilled at their deception that they could convince healthy people they were infected with plague. They would arrive at wealthy households, claim to detect early symptoms invisible to the untrained eye, then sell expensive preventive treatments to terrified families. They created artificial epidemics in affluent neighborhoods, manufacturing medical crises that generated enormous profits while spreading paranoia and social division. The plague doctor's treatment of children was particularly heartless. They would examine sick children with the same detached professionalism they applied to adults, showing no special compassion for youth or innocence. They would prescribe the same expensive, ineffective treatments regardless of the patient's age, forcing families to choose between their child's life and their financial survival. Many families sold themselves into indentured servitude to pay for treatments that had no chance of success. But here's what really happened when the plague doctors were alone with their patients, when the families were dismissed and the performance ended. They would often simply sit and wait, documenting the exact progression of symptoms not for medical knowledge, but for personal curiosity. They were witnesses to humanity's darkest hour, collectors of final moments, archivists of agony who preserved human suffering for their own twisted entertainment. The plague doctors understood that their real power came not from healing, but from the illusion of control. In a world where death was random and unstoppable, they provided the comforting fantasy that human knowledge could impose order on chaos. They sold the belief that suffering had purpose, that death followed rules, that expertise could triumph over fate. And people bought this fantasy, literally, until they had nothing left to trade except their own dignity. This systematic exploitation of human desperation established patterns that echo through medical history like a curse that refuses to be broken. The plague doctors didn't just profit from suffering, they institutionalized it, creating systems of medical commerce that prioritized profit over healing, performance over compassion, theatrical authority over genuine expertise. But wait, there's more to this story, darker layers that even I hesitate to reveal, because what I've shown you so far is just the surface of plague doctor culture. The real horror, the practices that were too disturbing even for their contemporaries to document officially, awaits in the shadows of history. Next time you put on a face mask, remember that you're wearing the descendant of that leather beak, and ask yourself, what other medical traditions have we inherited from these merchants of despair? You think you've reached the bottom of this abyss? You think you've seen the worst that human nature can produce when wrapped in medical authority? Oh, my dear chronicler of darkness, we're just getting started. Because there were practices so vile, so fundamentally wrong, that even the plague-ridden medieval world tried to pretend they didn't exist. But I was there, watching from the shadows, and I remember what they did when they thought no one was looking. The plague doctors didn't just exploit the dying, they created a secret economy of human misery, an underground market where suffering was the primary currency, and death was just another business transaction. They developed networks, connections, partnerships that would make modern organized crime seem like a children's charity. And at the center of this web sat the most successful plague doctors, the ones who understood that the real money wasn't in treating patients. It was in managing the entire ecosystem of desperation. Let me tell you about the harvesting. Yes, that's what they called it. A systematic collection of resources from plague victims that went far beyond simple payment for services. When a plague doctor entered a household, they weren't just there to examine the sick. They were there to catalog everything of value, to identify what could be extracted before the family died or fled. They had assistants, apprentices, entire teams dedicated to this morbid inventory process. The most valuable items weren't gold or silver, though they took those too. The real treasures were the personal documents, the family records, the legal papers that established property ownership and inheritance rights. Plague doctors would steal these documents, then sell them to speculators, who would claim abandoned properties after entire families had died. They were literally profiting from the extinction of bloodlines, turning family annihilation into real estate opportunities. But even this wasn't the worst of it. Some plague doctors developed what they called cultivation techniques. They would deliberately spread plague to healthy communities, not through ignorance or carelessness, but as a calculated business strategy. They would visit healthy households, claim to detect early symptoms, then contaminate the environment using materials they had collected from previous patients. They were creating their own customer base, manufacturing demand for their services through biological warfare. The cultivation process was sophisticated and systematic. Plague doctors would carry contaminated materials in special containers hidden within their medical bags. They would touch doorknobs, water sources, food supplies, clothing, anything that family members might contact. Then they would return a few days later to coincidentally discover that the plague had mysteriously appeared in the household. The family would pay premium prices for treatment, never suspecting that their savior was actually their destroyer. Some plague doctors became so skilled at cultivation that they could control the timing and spread of outbreaks. They would target wealthy neighborhoods during specific seasons, creating artificial epidemics that generated maximum profit while avoiding suspicion. They understood disease transmission better than anyone, not to prevent it, but to weaponize it. They were biological terrorists, wearing medical credentials. The most successful cultivators developed regional territories, areas where they held exclusive rights to plague treatment. They would eliminate competition through intimidation, violence, or strategic contamination. If another doctor tried to establish practice in their territory, they would suddenly develop plague symptoms themselves, forcing them to leave or die. They created medical monopolies, enforced through biological warfare. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of plague doctor culture was their relationship with death itself. They didn't just witness death. They collected it, preserved it, traded it like any other commodity. They kept detailed records of how people died, what they said in their final moments, how their families reacted to loss. These records weren't medical documents. They were inventories of human suffering, catalogs of agony that they sold to wealthy patrons who found entertainment in other people's misery. Some plague doctors became death artists, developing elaborate rituals around the dying process. They would arrange deathbed scenes like theatrical performances, positioning family members for maximum emotional impact, timing their own appearances to coincide with the patient's final breaths. They turned death into entertainment, charging admission to witness the final moments of plague victims who had no choice but to perform in this macabre theater. The most depraved plague doctors developed what they called finishing techniques. These were methods for hastening death in patients who were taking too long to die. They would use subtle poisons, deliberately infected instruments, or simply withhold any treatment that might actually help. They justified these murders as acts of mercy, claiming they were ending suffering. In reality, they were clearing inventory, making room for new customers in their schedule of profitable death. Some plague doctors became obsessed with the moment of death itself, believing they could capture the soul as it left the body. They would position mirrors around dying patients, convinced that the reflection would reveal the exact instant of spiritual departure. They collected these mirrors, claiming they contained fragments of captured souls, then sold them to wealthy collectors who displayed them as conversation pieces. The plague doctors also developed elaborate post-mortem rituals. They wouldn't just certify death, they would conduct detailed examinations of corpses, documenting the precise effects of plague on human tissue. But these examinations weren't scientific, they were pornographic. They would invite wealthy patrons to observe these dissections, charging admission to witness the intimate details of plague's destruction of human flesh. Some plague doctors became so detached from human suffering that they developed betting systems based on patient outcomes. They would wager on exactly how long patients would survive, what their final words would be, how their families would react to their deaths. They turned human misery into gambling entertainment, treating death like a sporting event where they had inside information about the likely outcomes. The most successful plague doctors understood that their real product wasn't medicine, it was psychological manipulation. They became experts in exploiting grief, fear, desperation, and guilt. They would convince families that their loved one's suffering was punishment for some moral failing, then sell expensive rituals designed to appease divine anger. They commercialized guilt, turning spiritual crisis into financial opportunity. But here's the part that really reveals the depth of their depravity. They kept trophies. Personal items stolen from dead patients, locks of hair, final letters, even pieces of clothing stained with plague victims' blood. They would display these items in their private chambers, creating museums of human suffering that served as both entertainment and professional validation. They were collectors of misery, archivists of agony who preserved human suffering for their own twisted pleasure. Some plague doctors developed partnerships with gravediggers, church officials, and property speculators. They would share information about which families were likely to die, which properties would become available, which inheritances would be left unclaimed. They created an entire economy based on predicted death, turning human extinction into investment opportunities. The plague doctors also understood that their real power came from their ability to determine who lived and who died. They would accept bribes to prioritize certain patients, to delay treatment for others, to provide false death certificates that would benefit specific heirs. They were literally selling life and death, treating human existence as just another commodity to be bought and sold. But the most disturbing aspect of plague doctor culture was how they justified their actions to themselves. They developed elaborate philosophical frameworks that portrayed their exploitation as necessary services, their cruelty as professional detachment, their murder as medical mercy. They convinced themselves that they were heroes, that their work was essential, that their profits were justified by the risks they took. This self-deception was so complete that many plague doctors genuinely believed they were saving lives, even while they were systematically destroying them. They developed professional pride in their efficiency, their thoroughness, their ability to extract maximum value from human suffering. They saw themselves as skilled craftsmen, artists of exploitation who had perfected the techniques of profitable compassion. The plague doctors created training programs for their apprentices, passing down the techniques of medical exploitation from one generation to the next. They developed textbooks, manuals, guidebooks that documented not medical knowledge but manipulation techniques. They were creating an institutional culture of medical predation, ensuring that their methods would survive long after the plague had ended. Some plague doctors became so skilled at their deception that they could convince healthy people they were dying, then sell them expensive treatments for imaginary illnesses. They created artificial medical crises, manufacturing symptoms through psychological manipulation and subtle poisoning. They were literally creating disease, then profiting from its treatment. The most successful plague doctors understood that their real skill wasn't medicine, it was theater. They were performance artists who had learned to monetize human desperation, entertainers who had discovered that suffering could be transformed into profit. They were the original medical entertainers, and the ancestors of every healthcare system that prioritizes profit over healing. But this culture of medical exploitation didn't disappear with the plague. It evolved, adapted, transformed itself to fit new circumstances and new opportunities. The techniques developed by plague doctors became the foundation for centuries of medical commercialization, the blueprint for healthcare systems that treat patients as customers and suffering as a market opportunity. And now, as you sit in your comfortable modern world, convinced that we've evolved beyond such barbarity, I want you to consider something. Every time you receive a medical bill that bankrupts your family, every time you watch pharmaceutical companies price life-saving medications beyond the reach of those who need them, every time you see healthcare systems that prioritize profit over healing, you're witnessing the direct descendants of those leather-wrapped vultures who first discovered that human suffering could be monetized. The plague doctors didn't just exploit a historical crisis. They created the template for modern medical commerce. They established the precedent that healthcare is a business, that suffering is a commodity, that human life has a price tag. They proved that people will pay anything to avoid death, even when the treatment is worse than the disease. So the next time you put on a medical mask, remember that you're wearing the descendant of that leather beak. And ask yourself, In a world where medical bankruptcy is common, where life-saving treatments are rationed based on ability to pay, where healthcare systems prioritize shareholder profits over patient outcomes, how much have we really changed since those dark days when death stalked the earth wearing a leather mask and carrying a wooden cane? But you think this corruption stayed contained within the medical profession? You think the plague doctors' innovations in human exploitation remained locked away in their leather-bound journals? Oh, you naive soul. You still don't understand how evil spreads, how corruption metastasizes through society like a cancer that refuses to be contained. The plague doctors didn't just poison medicine, they infected every institution they touched, creating a viral methodology of exploitation that spread faster than the plague itself. Because here's what really happened when the plague doctors' techniques proved so profitable. Other professions took notice. They studied the methods, adapted the strategies, implemented the psychological manipulation techniques that had proved so effective in extracting wealth from human suffering. The plague doctors became teachers, inadvertent professors of exploitation, who created an entire curriculum of human predation. The church was the first to embrace plague doctor methodology. Priests and bishops watched these leather-wrapped entrepreneurs extract fortunes from dying families and thought, we should be doing that. They began arriving at plague-stricken households immediately after the doctors left, claiming that spiritual salvation was even more important than physical healing. They would sell prayers, blessed objects, and forgiveness for sins that they claimed had caused the plague in the first place. But the clergy took the exploitation even further. They convinced families that their loved one's suffering was divine punishment, that death from plague was evidence of moral failure. They would sell increasingly expensive rituals designed to cleanse the dying person's soul, to ensure passage to heaven, to protect surviving family members from similar divine wrath. They commercialized guilt and fear with the same precision that plague doctors had commercialized hope and desperation. Some priests developed what they called salvation packages, elaborate combinations of prayers, rituals, and blessed objects that promised to guarantee heavenly admission for plague victims. These packages were priced according to the family's wealth, with premium options for those who could afford them. The wealthy got full funeral masses, elaborate burial ceremonies, and perpetual prayers for their souls. The poor got a quick blessing and a shallow grave. The legal profession was next to adopt plague doctor techniques. Lawyers realized that families desperate to save dying loved ones were also desperate to protect their inheritances, their property rights, their business interests. They began arriving at plague-stricken households with complex legal documents claiming to offer protection against estate seizure, property disputes, and inheritance challenges. These lawyers developed what they called crisis contracts, legal agreements that seemed to protect family interests, but actually transferred wealth to the lawyers themselves. They would convince panicked families to sign documents granting them power of attorney, property management rights, and legal guardianship over children. By the time families realized what they had signed, their lawyers had already stripped away everything of value. The most cynical lawyers would actually create the legal problems they claimed to solve. They would file false property claims, initiate bogus inheritance disputes, and challenge legitimate wills. Then they would approach the targeted families, offering to resolve these manufactured crises for substantial fees. They were creating legal emergencies, then profiting from their resolution. Merchants and traders quickly learned to exploit plague-related desperation. They would arrive in affected areas with claimed miracle cures, protective amulets, and survival supplies. They would spread rumors about impending shortages, creating artificial scarcity that drove prices to astronomical levels. They were profiting from panic, turning fear into a commodity that could be bought and sold. Some merchants developed what they called plague insurance, expensive contracts that promised to provide food, shelter, and medical care if the purchaser became infected. These contracts were deliberately written with impossible conditions and hidden clauses that voided coverage when it was actually needed. They were selling false security, charging premium prices for protection that never existed. The most successful merchants understood that their real product wasn't goods or services, it was the illusion of control. They sold talismans that supposedly prevented infection, maps that showed safe routes through contaminated areas, and information about which cities were plague-free. They were commercializing hope, turning human desperation into a renewable resource that could be harvested indefinitely. But perhaps the most disturbing adaptation of plague doctor methodology occurred within families themselves. Parents learned to exploit their children's fear, spouses learned to manipulate their partner's desperation, and children learned to profit from their parents' panic. The plague doctors had demonstrated that human suffering could be monetized, and families began applying these lessons to their own relationships. Some parents would convince their children that family survival depended on their sacrifice, their willingness to work without pay, their acceptance of dangerous conditions. They would sell their children's labor to plague doctors, lawyers, and merchants, claiming that this exploitation was necessary for family survival. They were trading their children's futures for immediate financial gain. Spouses would hide family resources, claiming they had been lost to plague doctor fees, then use these hidden assets to establish secret financial independence. They would manipulate their partner's fear of death, convincing them to sign over property rights, business interests, and inheritance claims. They were using plague-induced panic to restructure family power dynamics in their favor. Children would report on their parents' hidden resources, selling information to plague doctors, lawyers, and creditors in exchange for promises of future security. They would document their parents' weaknesses, their fears, their desperate decisions, then use this information to manipulate inheritance distributions. They were betraying family trust for personal advantage. The plague doctors had created a culture where exploitation was normalized, where predation was justified as necessary survival behavior. They had demonstrated that human suffering could be transformed into profit, that desperation could be harvested like any other natural resource. And this lesson spread through society like a virus, infecting every relationship, every institution, every interaction between human beings. Government officials quickly learned to exploit plague-related chaos. They would seize abandoned properties, claiming them for the state, then sell them to private buyers for personal profit. They would impose emergency taxes on surviving families, claiming these funds were needed for public health measures. They would sell official documents, travel permits, and burial licenses at inflated prices to families who had no choice but to pay. Some officials would actually prevent plague containment efforts, allowing the disease to spread in order to maximize their opportunities for exploitation. They would delay quarantine measures, hide information about infection rates, and prevent effective treatments from reaching affected areas. They were prolonging the crisis to extend their profit opportunities. The most cynical officials would create bureaucratic obstacles that forced families to pay bribes for basic services. They would require multiple permits for burial, complex documentation for property transfer, and expensive certifications for travel. They were turning grief into an administrative maze that could only be navigated through financial payments. Military leaders discovered that plague-stricken areas were perfect for testing new forms of social control. They would establish checkpoints that required payment for passage, impose martial law that suspended normal legal protections, and create emergency powers that allowed them to seize property without compensation. They were using plague panic to experiment with authoritarian control techniques. Some military units would actually spread plague to enemy territories, using contaminated materials as biological weapons. They would trade infected goods, send plague-carrying animals into enemy cities, and deliberately contaminate water supplies. They were weaponizing the disease, turning human suffering into military strategy. The most successful military leaders understood that plague created opportunities for territorial expansion. They would invade weakened regions, claiming to provide assistance while actually seizing control. They would establish permanent occupations in areas that had been devastated by disease, using humanitarian aid as a cover for conquest. But the most insidious spread of plague doctor methodology occurred through education. Teachers and scholars who had observed these exploitation techniques began incorporating them into their instruction. They taught students that human suffering was a natural resource that could be harvested, that desperation was a market opportunity, that exploitation was a legitimate survival strategy. These educators created textbooks that documented exploitation techniques, established schools that taught predation as professional skill, and developed curricula that normalized the commercialization of human suffering. They were institutionalizing the plague doctors' methods, ensuring that future generations would view exploitation as natural and necessary. Some educators would actually create artificial crises in their classrooms, manufacturing emergencies that forced students to make desperate decisions. They would observe how students responded to pressure, document their decision-making processes, and evaluate their willingness to exploit others. They were conducting experiments in human predation, using education as a laboratory for studying exploitation techniques. The plague doctors had created more than a medical crisis. They had established a new social paradigm where exploitation was normalized, where predation was professionalized, where human suffering was viewed as a renewable resource. They had demonstrated that any crisis could be transformed into profit opportunity, that any desperation could be harvested for personal gain. This methodology spread through every level of society, from individual families to international governments. It became the foundation for economic systems that prioritize profit over human welfare, political systems that exploit crisis for authoritarian gain, and social systems that normalize the commercialization of suffering. The plague doctors didn't just exploit a historical crisis, they created the template for modern exploitation. They established the precedent that human suffering is a commodity, that desperation is a market opportunity, that crisis is a chance for profit. They proved that people will pay anything to avoid death, even when the cure is worse than the disease. And this template didn't disappear with the plague. It evolved, adapted, transformed itself to fit new circumstances and new opportunities. Every economic bubble, every political crisis, every social emergency has been an opportunity for someone to apply plague doctor methodology to transform human suffering into personal profit. The techniques that plague doctors developed for exploiting medical emergencies became the foundation for disaster capitalism, crisis profiteering, and shock doctrine economics. They established the precedent that emergency conditions justify suspension of normal ethical constraints, that desperate people can be exploited without moral consequence, that crisis creates opportunities for permanent restructuring of social power. So when you watch how modern societies respond to crisis, when you see how emergencies are transformed into profit opportunities, when you observe how human suffering is commercialized and monetized, remember that you're witnessing the direct application of plague doctor methodology. The leather masks have been replaced by business suits, the wooden canes by corporate logos, but the essential dynamic remains unchanged. Those with power exploit those without it, and crisis creates the perfect conditions for systematic predation. But this story isn't finished yet, because the plague doctor's influence extends even deeper into modern society than you might imagine. Their techniques didn't just shape how we respond to crisis, they fundamentally altered how we understand the relationship between suffering and profit, between desperation and opportunity, between human need and commercial exploitation. The most disturbing chapter of this story is how completely their worldview has been normalized, how thoroughly their methods have been integrated into the fabric of modern civilization. And that revelation will change everything you think you know about the world you live in. You think you're free from the plague doctor's influence? You think their methods died with them in those plague-ravaged medieval cities? Oh, you sweet, deluded soul, you're living in their world, breathing their air, participating in their system every single day. The plague doctors didn't disappear. They evolved. They shed their leather masks and wooden canes, but their essential nature remains unchanged. They're your insurance agents, your pharmaceutical executives, your healthcare administrators, your financial advisors. They're everyone who profits from your desperation, who commercializes your suffering, who transforms your fear into their fortune. Look around you. Really look. That monthly premium you pay for health insurance, knowing that when you actually need treatment, you'll face deductibles, copays, and coverage denials that could bankrupt your family, that's plague doctor methodology. They're charging you for the illusion of protection, selling you the fantasy that your suffering has been monetized away, that your desperation has been transformed into someone else's profit margin. The modern insurance industry is the direct descendant of plague doctor practices. They've perfected the art of charging premium prices for promises they have no intention of keeping. They use actuarial tables instead of astrological charts, statistical models instead of crystal balls, but the essential dynamic remains unchanged. They're selling hope to desperate people, then finding creative ways to avoid delivering on their promises. Insurance companies have developed what they call managed care, which is really just a sophisticated version of plague doctor triage. They decide who gets treatment based on profit margins, not medical need. They delay approval for expensive procedures, hoping patients will die before they have to pay. They deny coverage for experimental treatments, even when they're the only hope for survival. They're literally deciding who lives and who dies based on quarterly earnings reports. The pharmaceutical industry has taken plague doctor methodology to its logical conclusion. They don't just exploit existing suffering, they create it. They develop medications that treat symptoms without curing diseases, ensuring lifetime customer relationships. They price life-saving drugs at levels that force families to choose between treatment and financial survival. They're holding people's lives hostage, demanding ransom payments for the privilege of continued existence. Some pharmaceutical companies actually purchase patents for existing medications, then dramatically increase the price, not because production costs have risen, but because they can. They're creating artificial scarcity in life-saving treatments, manufacturing medical emergencies that generate enormous profits. They're weaponizing human need, turning desperation into a renewable resource that can be harvested indefinitely. The most cynical pharmaceutical executives understand that their real product isn't medicine, it's hope. They sell the possibility of recovery, the chance of remission, the dream of cure. They know that desperate people will pay anything for these possibilities, even when the actual medical benefit is minimal. They're commercializing human optimism, turning the will to live into a market commodity. But the pharmaceutical industry's most disturbing innovation is their relationship with regulatory agencies. They've created what amounts to a protection racket, where they fund the very agencies that are supposed to regulate them. They sponsor the research that determines drug safety, finance the studies that establish treatment protocols, and employ the scientists who make approval decisions. They've captured the regulatory system, turning government oversight into marketing support. The financial services industry has adapted plague doctor techniques for economic exploitation. They target people during financial crises, offering complex products that promise security but actually increase risk. They use technical language that sounds reassuring but obscures predatory terms. They're selling financial protection that doesn't exist, charging premium prices for services that benefit only the providers. Credit card companies and payday lenders have perfected the art of exploiting financial desperation. They target people who are already struggling, offering immediate relief that creates long-term dependency. They use psychological manipulation techniques that would make plague doctors proud, convincing people that debt is freedom, that borrowing is investment, that financial exploitation is actually financial empowerment. Some financial advisors have developed what they call crisis portfolios, investment strategies specifically designed to profit from human suffering. They invest in companies that benefit from natural disasters, economic collapse, and social unrest. They're betting on human misery, treating catastrophe as a market opportunity. They've turned suffering into an investment category, misery into an asset class. The education industry has embraced plague doctor methodology through student loan programs that create lifelong debt dependency. They convince students that education is an investment in their future, then saddle them with debt that will define their entire adult life. They're selling the promise of economic mobility while ensuring economic servitude. Universities have developed what they call premium programs, educational opportunities that cost exponentially more than standard options, but provide only marginally better outcomes. They're creating educational class systems, where the quality of education depends on ability to pay rather than merit or need. They're commercializing knowledge, turning learning into a luxury commodity. Some educational institutions actually create artificial barriers to graduation, requiring additional courses, fees, and certifications that generate revenue without providing educational value. They're extending the debt accumulation period, maximizing extraction from each student before allowing them to escape the system. The legal profession has industrialized plague doctor techniques through what they call litigation management. They create complex legal processes that require expensive professional assistance, then charge hourly rates that ensure only the wealthy can afford justice. They're selling legal protection that should be a basic right, turning the justice system into a private marketplace. Some lawyers have developed what they call settlement mills, operations that process large volumes of cases with minimal individual attention. They convince clients to accept inadequate settlements, then take substantial percentages of the reduced awards. They're commercializing injustice, turning legal victimization into profit opportunities. The most cynical legal professionals actually create the legal problems they claim to solve. They file frivolous lawsuits, initiate bogus claims, and manufacture legal emergencies that require expensive resolution. They're generating artificial legal crises, then profiting from their resolution. But perhaps the most disturbing evolution of plague doctor methodology is its integration into everyday commercial relationships. Every subscription service that's difficult to cancel, every free trial that becomes expensive recurring billing, every warranty that excludes the most likely problems. Every customer service system designed to frustrate rather than help is an application of plague doctor psychology. Modern retailers have perfected the art of exploiting consumer desperation. They create artificial urgency through limited time offers, and while supplies last marketing. They use psychological manipulation to convince people they need things they don't want, that they're missing opportunities that don't exist. They're commercializing anxiety, turning consumer insecurity into profit opportunities. Some retailers have developed what they call loss leader strategies, where they sell certain products at losses to attract customers, then compensate by overcharging for related items. They're creating artificial value propositions, manipulating consumer psychology to maximize extraction from each transaction. The technology industry has embraced plague doctor methodology through planned obsolescence and proprietary systems. They design products that fail predictably, requiring expensive replacement or repair. They create dependency relationships where consumers must continue purchasing upgrades, accessories, and services to maintain functionality. They're selling technological hope while ensuring technological disappointment. Some technology companies actually slow down older devices through software updates, forcing consumers to purchase new products to maintain basic functionality. They're creating artificial technological emergencies, manufacturing obsolescence to generate renewable revenue stream. The most sophisticated technology companies understand that their real product isn't hardware or software, it's user dependency. They design systems that become increasingly difficult to abandon, that integrate so deeply into daily life that switching becomes practically impossible. They're commercializing convenience, turning technological assistance into technological control. But the true genius of modern plague doctor methodology is how it's been normalized, how it's been integrated into economic systems so completely that we no longer recognize it as exploitation. We've been conditioned to accept that suffering should be profitable, that desperation should be commercialized, that human need should be transformed into market opportunity. We live in a world where healthcare bankruptcy is common, where life-saving treatments are rationed based on ability to pay, where pharmaceutical companies price medications to maximize profit rather than maximize health. We accept that education should create lifelong debt, that legal protection should be available only to those who can afford it, that financial services should benefit providers rather than consumers. This normalization of exploitation has created what economists call market efficiency, but what the plague doctors would recognize as systematic predation. We've built economic systems that reward the extraction of maximum value from human desperation, that incentivize the commercialization of suffering, that treat human need as a renewable resource to be harvested. The plague doctors established this precedent that crisis creates opportunity, that desperation can be monetized, that human suffering should be transformed into profit. They prove that people will pay anything to avoid death, even when the cure is worse than the disease. And we've built entire civilizations on this foundation, created economic systems that depend on the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. Every insurance premium, every pharmaceutical price, every financial service fee, every legal bill, every educational loan payment is a direct application of plague doctor methodology. We're living in their world, participating in their system, paying tribute to their legacy every single day. The leather masks have been replaced by corporate logos, the wooden canes by quarterly earnings reports, the Latin incantations by marketing slogans. But the essential dynamic remains unchanged. Those with power exploit those without it, and desperation creates the perfect conditions for systematic predation. So when you pay your monthly insurance premium, remember that you're participating in a system created by plague doctors. When you fill a prescription that costs more than your rent, remember that you're being exploited by their descendants. When you struggle with student loans, medical debt, or legal fees, remember that you're experiencing the direct application of techniques developed by leather-wrapped vultures who first discovered that human suffering could be monetized. But here's the most disturbing part of this story, the revelation that will shatter your understanding of modern civilization. The plague doctors didn't just influence how we respond to crisis, they fundamentally altered how we define human value, how we understand the relationship between need and worth, how we measure success and failure. They created a world where your value as a human being is determined by your ability to pay for your own survival, where your worth is measured by your capacity to transform your suffering into someone else's profit. The final chapter of this story will reveal how completely the plague doctors succeeded, how thoroughly their worldview has been integrated into modern consciousness, how perfectly they designed a system that perpetuates itself through the willing participation of its victims. And when you understand this final truth, you'll realize that the plague never ended. It just learned to wear a suit and carry a briefcase instead of a leather mask and wooden cane. You want to know the final truth? The most horrifying revelation about the plague doctor's legacy? It's not just that their methods survived, it's that they created a world where their victims became their willing accomplices, where the exploited learned to exploit, where the predators transformed their prey into predators. They didn't just build a system of exploitation. They built a self-perpetuating machine of human degradation that runs on the voluntary participation of its own victims. Because here's what really happened when the plague finally ended, when the last leather-wrapped vulture hung up their beak and counted their blood money. They didn't disappear. They evolved into something far more dangerous than medieval charlatan. They became the architects of modern civilization, the founding fathers of systems that would make their crude medieval exploitation look like child's play. The plague doctors understood something fundamental about human nature that we're still too terrified to acknowledge. People will not only pay anything to avoid death, they will become complicit in their own exploitation if you make them believe they have no choice. They will defend the system that destroys them. They will advocate for the policies that impoverish them. They will vote for the leaders who betray them, as long as you convince them that the alternative is worse. This psychological manipulation was the plague doctors' greatest innovation, their most enduring contribution to human civilization. They discovered that exploitation works best when the victims believe they're participants rather than prey, when they think they're making smart choices rather than being systematically destroyed. They learned to make people grateful for their own exploitation, thankful for the privilege of being robbed. Modern healthcare systems have perfected this psychological manipulation. They've convinced patients that medical bankruptcy is normal, that choosing between medication and rent is a reasonable dilemma, that rationing life-saving treatments based on ability to pay is somehow ethical. They've made people believe that healthcare is a commodity rather than a human right, that suffering should be profitable, that your life has value only if you can afford to maintain it. Insurance companies have become the ultimate expression of plague doctor psychology. They've convinced millions of people to pay monthly premiums for coverage that may never materialize, to accept deductibles that ensure they'll pay thousands before receiving any benefit, to navigate bureaucratic mazes designed to deny rather than provide care. They've made people grateful for the privilege of being systematically deceived, thankful for the opportunity to pay for promises that will never be kept. The pharmaceutical industry has taken this manipulation to its logical conclusion. They've convinced people that life-saving medications should cost more than houses, that research and development justifies any price, that corporate profits are more important than human survival. They've made people believe that questioning pharmaceutical pricing is somehow anti-science, that demanding affordable health care is somehow unreasonable. But the plague doctors' most brilliant innovation was making their exploitation seem inevitable, natural, even beneficial. They convinced people that predation was progress, that commercialization was civilization, that systematic exploitation was economic efficiency. They made people believe that any alternative to their system would be worse, that questioning their methods was dangerous, that accepting their exploitation was wisdom. Educational institutions have embraced this psychological manipulation through student loan programs that create lifelong debt dependency. They've convinced students that education is an investment rather than a right, that debt is freedom rather than servitude, that financial exploitation is actually financial empowerment. They've made people grateful for the privilege of being financially destroyed in exchange for pieces of paper that may or may not improve their economic prospects. The financial services industry has perfected the art of making exploitation seem like opportunity. They've convinced people that debt is wealth, that borrowing is investing, that financial dependency is financial freedom. They've made people believe that questioning predatory lending practices is somehow anti-business, that demanding fair financial services is somehow unreasonable. Legal systems have institutionalized plague doctor methodology by making justice a commodity available only to those who can afford it. They've convinced people that legal protection should be purchased rather than provided, that equality before the law is a luxury rather than a right, that systematic legal exploitation is somehow necessary for social order. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the plague doctor's legacy is how completely they succeeded in restructuring human consciousness. They didn't just create exploitative systems, they created people who would defend those systems, who would advocate for their own exploitation, who would attack anyone who questioned the legitimacy of their suffering. They created a world where people are proud of their medical debt, where they brag about working multiple jobs to afford basic health care, where they consider themselves lucky to have insurance that covers only a fraction of their medical expenses. They made people believe that suffering is character building, that exploitation is opportunity, that systematic predation is somehow beneficial for society. The plague doctors understood that the most effective exploitation is self-imposed, that the most profitable suffering is voluntary, that the most sustainable predation is democratic. They created systems where people vote for their own exploitation, where they choose their own predators, where they defend their own destruction. Modern political systems have embraced this methodology completely. They've convinced people to vote for policies that impoverish them, to support politicians who betray them, to defend systems that destroy them. They've made people believe that questioning authority is dangerous, that demanding accountability is unreasonable, that accepting systematic exploitation is patriotic. The plague doctor's greatest achievement wasn't just creating profitable suffering, it was creating people who would perpetuate that suffering, who would pass it on to their children, who would defend it as natural and necessary. They created a culture where exploitation is normalized, where predation is professionalized, where systematic destruction is celebrated as progress. They made people believe that their suffering has meaning, that their exploitation serves a purpose, that their destruction benefits society. They convinced people that questioning the system is selfish, that demanding better treatment is entitled, that expecting basic human dignity is unreasonable. The plague doctors didn't just profit from human suffering, they institutionalized it, systematized it, made it permanent. They created a world where suffering is renewable, where exploitation is sustainable, where predation is profitable. They built a machine that runs on human misery and convinced people that maintaining that machine is their civic duty. Modern economic systems are the direct descendants of plague doctor methodology. They've convinced people that poverty is a personal failing, that wealth inequality is natural, that systematic exploitation is somehow beneficial for economic growth. They've made people believe that questioning economic inequality is dangerous, that demanding fair wages is unreasonable, that expecting basic economic dignity is somehow anti-business. The plague doctors succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They created a world where their victims became their advocates, where their prey became their protectors, where their exploited became their defenders. They built a system so perfect, so complete, so thoroughly integrated into human consciousness that people can't imagine alternatives. They made people believe that their world is the only possible world, that their suffering is inevitable, that their exploitation is natural. They convince people that questioning their system is futile, that resistance is pointless, that acceptance is wisdom. But here's the final, most terrifying truth about the plague doctor's legacy. They created a world where people are grateful for their exploitation, where they thank their predators, where they defend their destroyers. They made people believe that their suffering is a privilege, that their exploitation is an opportunity, that their destruction is somehow beneficial. The plague doctors understood that the most effective control is self-imposed, that the most profitable suffering is voluntary, that the most sustainable exploitation is democratic. They created systems where people choose their own destruction, where they vote for their own suffering, where they defend their own exploitation. So when you pay your insurance premium while knowing coverage will be denied, remember that you're participating in a system created by plague doctors. When you take on debt for education that may not improve your prospects, remember that you're being exploited by their descendants. When you work multiple jobs to afford basic health care, remember that you're experiencing the direct application of techniques developed by leather-wrapped vultures who first discovered that human suffering could be monetized. The plague doctors didn't just steal money from the dying, they stole the future from the living. They created a world where their techniques would be permanent, where their exploitation would be perpetual, where their predation would be profitable forever. And the most horrifying part? They convinced us that this is normal, that this is natural, that this is the way things should be. They made us believe that questioning their legacy is dangerous, that imagining alternatives is unrealistic, that accepting their world is wisdom. The plague never ended. It just learned to wear a suit, carry a briefcase, and convince its victims that their suffering is their choice, their exploitation is their opportunity, their destruction is their privilege. The doctors of the Black Death didn't just treat a disease, they became one. And that disease still walks among us, still feeds on our suffering, still profits from our desperation. It just learned to make us grateful for the privilege of being consumed. Welcome to the world the plague doctors built. Welcome to the civilization they designed. Welcome to the future they created. And remember, every time you thank someone for the privilege of being exploited, every time you defend a system that destroys you, every time you choose your own predator, you're proving that the plague doctors succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They didn't just survive the plague, they became it.